Good morning, afternoon, good evening, whenever you are watching this. It's Dr. Jenkins here, and this is the first of our 2 videos on protein. So we've gone through the macronutrients carbohydrate, and we talked about the macronutrient of lipids or fat, and now here we are with protein. Usually, this is a chapter that develops quite a lot of interest from people. So I hope that you learn some good stuff, and I'm sure that you can if you're open to it. Here we go. Like we have before, we'll do a review, and then we will talk more specifically about some things that are unique to protein with digestion and absorption and metabolism. And then we'll spend a good deal of time talking about proteins and exercise. And then we'll end talking about some amino acids that are in some ergogenic aids or supplements. Let's jump right in, folks. This is going to be a review because we talked about this already. Remember, something that is unique structurally about amino acids, which, as we know, make up protein, is that amino acids have nitrogen. And this is something that carbohydrates and fat do not have. Carbohydrates, fat, and protein all have carbon, they all have hydrogen, and they all have oxygen in their structure, chemical structure. But what is unique about protein is it contains nitrogen, unlike carbohydrates and fat. Here's a picture of an amino acid, and there's the N for nitrogen. This nitrogen, it's what makes an amino acid. So in that way it's good, but on the downside, it can be a real pain in the butt to deal with. It makes protein harder to digest and absorb. It makes protein a little bit more difficult to metabolize. And it makes protein specifically more difficult to break down. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit because we're having... Is the cat okay?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, it's okay. I'm still recording, but I'm just checking in.
Sorry.
All right, sorry, folks. We had a little scare with one of our animals getting out, but she's okay. That nitrogen is what makes protein so hard to break down and to get rid of its breakdown products. Okay? All right. We remember that proteins are made up of smaller structures called amino acids. We remember that there are 20 total amino acids, and every protein in our body is made up of some combination of some of those same 20 amino acids. We can have short amino acid chains, or we could have long amino acid chains. When you see AA here, I'm not referring to Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm referring to amino acids. Here's a picture of an amino acid, but you do not need to know that specifically. It's just there so you can see what it looks like. I've got some pictures here just because I want to show you proteins come in all different shapes and sizes. So the way in which the body joins those amino acids varies significantly. Sometimes we can have a linear chain of amino acids, and that is actually a structural picture of insulin. Other times we can have smaller linear chains here, like we saw in the myofibrils making up skeletal muscle. But also we can have really, really complex. This is actually hemoglobin, which carries oxygen on the red blood cells. So this is when amino acids are first in a linear chain, but then those linear chains fold onto themselves to form these globules. And then in the case of hemoglobin, we have many, many globules joining together. I'm not going to ask you these specifically. It's just a way to show you that proteins are shaped differently. All right, this should also be a review. We remember that of the 20 amino acids, 11 our body can make for us, and the 11 that our body can make for us are considered to be non-essential. They're non-essential because it is not essential that we get them through the diet. Because our body makes them for us, it is not essential to get them through food. And then the remaining 9 are considered essential. Because our body cannot make them, it is essential that we get them through the diet. Cool. I've listed the actual amino acids here for you. You don't need to know them by name, but I've just listed them here so you can see them if you want. This we also know. See the beauty of doing that intro chapter with chapter 2? Now we can just reinforce it, and every time we hear it, it helps us to remember. About 10 to 35% of your dietary intake should come from protein. You might also see it written as 15 to 30%. Either way, roundabout. We also, for protein, talked about the exact number of grams of protein per kilogram of body weight needed. And for a sedentary person is someone that does not exercise regularly. They need, a good ballpark figure is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Know that number, both of these. Now, as we go on, we're going to see that for someone who is active, like athletes, they will most likely need a little bit more. Maybe it's 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Maybe it's 1.7, something like that, which we're going to talk about later. But these numbers aren't going to go up as high as you might have thought. 2.0 is the highest I would ever recommend someone. And that would have to be a pretty highly trained strength athlete. And remember, it's not that protein isn't important. Protein is just as important as carbohydrates and fat. But the difference is our body can make a lot of protein for us. So this means that we don't need as much through our diet. Okay? It's not because it's less important. It's just as important, protein. But our body makes some for us, so we don't need as much through diet. All right. This is also a review. I broke down the functions of protein in this exact way. One important function of protein in the body is structure. Helps to give structure to our 600 plus skeletal muscles. That's not including our cardiac muscle and our smooth muscle. Also gives structure to our tendons and ligaments, hair, nails, skin. Okay. Maybe one of the functions that is not as well known is that protein helps to form many of the important chemicals in our body. I've given you some examples here. You don't need to memorize every one of these examples, but a lot of important chemicals. We talked about enzymes in lab number 4, the chemical digestion of food. Enzymes help us to speed up chemical reactions. Hormones like insulin and glucagon and growth hormone are made up of protein. Antibodies that help us fight against illness. Neurotransmitters that help us send chemical messages, neurotransmitters that help us send chemical messages between neurons. Hemoglobin, which helps us to carry oxygen on red blood cells. Chemicals that help to regulate pH, this is very important. Those are called buffers. So all these really important chemicals are structurally made up of protein. And of course, the last thing is energy. We do not use a lot of protein for energy, and that is by design, folks. Only about 10 to 15% of our total energy should come from protein. If we don't have enough carbohydrates and fat, and our body is forced to have a higher amount of energy coming from protein, then it's going to take away from the other important functions. So it literally could take away protein from muscles. And as an athlete, you do not want that. All right. Let's talk about some of the unique things about protein digestion and absorption. One of the things that we did talk about was that we can begin chemical digestion of protein in the stomach. Talked about this in our GI chapter. Here is a review. We can begin chemical digestion of protein in the stomach, and that's a good thing. Protein is difficult to break down, so it's good that we get a head start. Something else I want to point out, something we already know, but just to make sure we're clear, digestion of protein takes longer than carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates can be digested and absorbed and metabolized the fastest. Protein and fat, for the record, take longer. Last thing that is unique about protein that I want to point out is that when we absorb those amino acids from the small intestine through the small intestine wall into the bloodstream, when we absorb those amino acids into the bloodstream, it requires a carrier. We don't need to get that much in the weeds about that. Suffice to say, it's just an added step. The way that protein is structured, the amino acids, we have to get like another carrier, another molecule to help it be absorbed. It's another step. It makes it more, it makes protein absorption take more energy, and it makes it occur more slowly than the absorption of carbohydrates. So these are the 3 things I'd like you to review. All right, now, I know we see these scientific terms and you might want to run for the hills, but you don't have to. Stay. Part of my job here is to make things more understandable. So let's do that. I mentioned already that something unique about the amino acids is that they contain nitrogen. And that makes them a pain in the butt. So one of the things that we have to do when we're going to break down proteins is we have to remove that nitrogen. In order to break down this amino acid even further and then absorb it, we got to get rid of that nitrogen. And that is a difficult process. Here are 2 ways in which we can get rid of that nitrogen. There's one way called transamination, and there's another way called deamination. And if you're paying attention, you can actually see in the word transamination or deamination, what they're talking about is removing this amine group, deamination. Amine is in the name. Transamination, it's in the name. We're trying to remove that amine group because that amine group is what contains the nitrogen. The only one that you need to know is deamination. Just trying to give you an example here. The process of deamination is when we remove that nitrogen. So we remove the nitrogen, and then we use that nitrogen to form ammonia. We will eventually send this to the liver to break it down even further. And then eventually we'll send that to the kidneys. And eventually we'll pee it out. This is how we get rid of that nitrogen. Complicated, isn't it? I know. Deamination is only this part, okay? So this is deamination. The process of removing nitrogen and converting it into ammonia. And this is something that we do in our body quite often. We remove something, and that thing that we removed morphs into a different molecule. In this case, we're taking that nitrogen and we're kind of morphing it into ammonia. And that's just a way that we can get rid of something. It's just easier for our body to transport ammonia than it is to just transport nitrogen by itself. All right, so we're going to keep it simple. We know that something that's unique about amino acids is that they contain nitrogen. When we're going to break down that amino acid, we need to get rid of that nitrogen. One example of a way that our body can get rid of that nitrogen is a process called deamination. In the process of deamination, nitrogen is removed from the amino acid, and that nitrogen forms ammonia that our body will then get rid of. The extra information, in case you're interested, is that ammonia goes to the liver and then to the kidneys where we can pee out the remnants. See, folks, sometimes science can be not so bad if we can keep it simple. All right, this is what I was talking about before. That ammonia is actually toxic. See, this nitrogen is so difficult for us to get rid of that we have to form it into something that's toxic for a period of time. As I mentioned to you, one way that we can do that happens to be called the urea cycle, and I'd like you to just know that. If I go back, let me change colors. What I have in green is the process called deamination, where we remove nitrogen and it gets converted into a molecule of ammonia. The remaining part of this is the process of the urea cycle. So what is in orange? What we do with that ammonia. We take it to the liver and then to the kidneys, and we can pee out the ammonia remnants. What's in orange is the process called the urea cycle, where ammonia is transported to the liver. It is converted into urea. You don't have to know that necessarily, but we'll just know that this process is called the urea cycle, where that ammonia goes to the liver, where it is converted into urea, and then what it's converted into goes to the kidneys. And of course, from the kidneys, we can decide what waste products we want to pee out. All right, I'm excited. We're getting into some real science here. Tried to break it down as best I can. I am always here for questions. You can listen to this part of the video over and over again. That's one of the benefits, okay? All right. I didn't cover this one. You don't have to know it. There is another way we can get rid of that ammonia. We can convert it into a substance called glutamine, but you do not need to know that. See, that nitrogen is tricky, isn't it? We've got to do a lot to get rid of it. I'm telling you. Okay, now let's talk about the metabolism of protein. And this is going to be a bit of a different conversation than what we talked about with the metabolism of carbohydrates and fat. So what I want to do is I first want to just talk about some basics. And I'm going to stay on this slide because I just want to address the word metabolism. One way to define metabolism is to define it as the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. That is indeed an accurate definition of metabolism. Sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. And I think we can make sense of that. We can say someone has a high metabolic rate, then their chemical reactions, or the sum of all their chemical reactions in the body, happen quickly. If someone has a lower metabolism or lower metabolic rate, the sum of their chemical reactions, all their chemical reactions, happen more slowly. When it comes to nutrition, we tend to define metabolism more narrowly. So instead of talking about the sum of all chemical reactions, when it comes to nutrition, and what we're going to talk about right now with protein metabolism, we tend to be a little bit more narrow in our definition. So it's when I'm talking about protein metabolism, I'm talking about the specific chemical reactions involved, and we usually say converting a nutrient into energy. Okay, so the actual overall definition of metabolism is what's in red, sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. However, it's common when we're discussing nutrition to have a more narrow definition and only be referring to the chemical reactions that are involved in breaking down carbohydrates for energy. So indeed, that is what I mean when I say carbohydrate metabolism, breaking carbohydrates down for energy, or ATP. And remember, this is all happening in a sequential order. We bring in food, we have to digest it or break it down, then we have to absorb it into the bloodstream, and then it can go to cells to be metabolized for energy. But it has to happen in that order. When we talked about the lipids chapter, we talked about fat. We can absolutely have fat metabolism, which is to say, the chemical reactions involved in converting fat into energy. Okay, so I just want to make that clear. I think it's some people can get confused with when we use the term metabolism. Now, protein, the body does things a little bit differently with protein than it does with carbohydrates and fat. So let's break this down. One thing after absorption, so I want to just remember, it has to come in order. So we had to ingest the food, or in this case, our body can make some for us. We've got to, but let's just stick to ingesting the food for this example. Then we have to digest it or break it down. Then we have to absorb it. So we ingest the food, we digest it or break it down, then we absorb it into the bloodstream. So what happens with those absorbed amino acids? We have two options. The less common option is that we metabolize it for energy, just like we do with fats and carbohydrates. So what did I say? About 10 to 15% of all of our energy in the muscles comes from protein. So a relatively small amount of those absorbed amino acids will go on to be metabolized for energy. Okay, but this is definitely less common. Instead, this is something that's unique to protein. Instead, the majority, so we'll siphon off a little bit of amino acids to go to the muscles to be metabolized for energy. But the majority of our absorbed amino acids form what's called amino acid pools. This happens in the liver. So a large portion of our amino acids, once they're absorbed into the blood, then they go to the liver. A large portion of our amino acids go to the liver, and the liver forms these amino acid pools. And all an amino acid pool is a small collection of amino acids in bloodstream. So really, it's just like we get a bunch of amino acids together. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how many, but maybe here, this is our amino acid pool. That was a really bad circle, wasn't it? Let me try that again. There we go. I can do better than that. This is our amino acid pool. It's literally just a grouping of amino acids. So the liver, it basically chunks together these amino acids into small groups. And each of these groups is called an amino acid pool. And this amino acid pool will circulate in the bloodstream. That's it. Okay, so if we ingest protein, our body will digest it, break it down into smaller pieces. Then we will absorb it into the bloodstream. And then our body has two options, two things that it can do with those absorbed amino acids. A small amount of those absorbed amino acids will be sent out to the muscle cells to be metabolized for energy. But the majority of our absorbed amino acids will actually be formed into what's called amino acid pools. Small collections of amino acids that will then go on to travel the bloodstream. Excellent. Now, you can see that I did make another note. Some amino acids are used to make new compounds, but don't worry about that for now. Let's focus on what's in red. Excellent. Speaking of these amino acid pools, we've already defined them. An amino acid pool is a collection of amino acids that travel in the bloodstream. Collections of amino acids that circulate in blood. It's a very simple process here. So we have these amino acid pools, just a little grouping of amino acids, and they just travel in the bloodstream. So as these amino acid pools travel in the bloodstream, what if some cells in the muscle need it? Well, then right as those amino acid pools are about to go by in the bloodstream, the muscle cells can be like, hey, I need some of you. And then the amino acids can go into the muscle to repair muscle. Or what if we need amino acids in the skin to repair structure of the skin? Well, right as an amino acid pool is in the bloodstream about to pass that very area of the skin can say, hey, I need some amino acids. So it's like we can just, as the amino acid pools travel in the bloodstream, parts of the body can just take them as they need it. Quite simple, isn't it? Now, I want to make another point here. We do not store large amounts of protein. I'm going to write it down because it's that important. How about that? Let's think for a minute. Can we store carbohydrates in the body? Ding, ding, ding. Yes, we can. We can store glucose as glycogen. And we can store a ton of glycogen. Remember I told you that for most people, they have enough glycogen storage to fuel a 20-mile run? We can store a lot of glycogen in the liver and the skeletal muscles. Okay. Can we store fat? Absolutely. I think most of us, I can point to some areas on my body where I've stored too much fat. We can store a lot of fat, almost endless amounts. So we can store large amounts of fat and large amounts of carbohydrates. But when it comes to protein, we cannot. Even though we do, quote unquote, store amino acids in these amino acid pools, it's not like storing a large amount. So we can't shove some protein in the shelves of the liver for later. Okay, so we cannot store large amounts of protein. And as we're going to talk about in our second video, this is an important thing to consider. So we know that our body makes protein for us. And because our body makes protein for us, we don't need to get as much protein through our diet. Okay, we also know that our body cannot store large amounts of protein. So can you see a potential problem developing? I can. What if we bring in more protein than we need? Right? if we bring in more protein than we need, can our body store it in large amounts? No. Can our body easily break down protein to get rid of its end products? No. That nitrogen is a pain in the butt. We got to go through a process called deamination to form ammonia. Then we've got to do the urea cycle. We've got to transport that ammonia, all these places, eventually to our kidneys. So we cannot store large amounts of protein, and protein is difficult to break down and get rid of. So if we, in fact, bring in more protein than we need, if we bring in more protein than our body can store, and if we bring in more protein than we can keep up with breaking down and get rid of, what will our body do with that extra protein? It can't store it, and we can only keep up with breaking it down to a certain pace. So guess what, folks? If we bring in more protein than we need, more protein than we can store, more protein than we can keep up with breaking down and getting rid of, our body has no choice but to convert it into fat. I'm guessing when people bring in extra protein, that is not what they're thinking is going to happen to it. So as an athlete particularly, we don't want excess fat in many cases. We know we need more protein, but we also don't want to bring in too much because it'll turn into fat. So we'll discuss this much more later. But I wanted to plant the seed. Okay. Let's see. All right. We're going to go up to proteins and exercise, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll pick up with a second video. I did mention this earlier, that one thing that could happen is that we can use amino acids and form something else. I would just like you to know this term. And I know we're getting a little bit specific here because we have glucose, we have glycogen, and now we have gluconeogenesis. It's a lot of words. When I think of how to memorize this word, I think about Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Genesis is the creation of. So gluconeogenesis, and you could also say that neo could be a prefix for new. Gluconeogenesis is when we form glucose from non-glucose sources. And our body is able to do that in certain amounts. So, in fact, some of that excess protein we can actually convert into, we can take that protein and we can convert it into glucose. That process of converting something that's not originally glucose into glucose is called gluconeogenesis. Just be able to define that term. All right. I'm going to end this topic here. The process of protein turnover, it just means that we're continually breaking down old amino acids and then using new amino acids to form new healthy amino acids. I mean, I think you can understand this. Let's have a look here. This is a picture from a different textbook. I don't love it, but I do like the picture of the amino acid pool because it just tells you how simple it is. Well, what's going to happen? Let's say that some of these amino acids get old and they can no longer function. We're going to want to break those down. Like anything else in our body, when a molecule has been used over and over again, it can get old and no longer be able to function. So we're constantly taking old amino acids that can no longer do their job, and we're breaking them down and getting rid of the breakdown products through the urea cycle. So what we want to do is, for whatever amino acids we break down, we need to replace with new. So if in a given moment we've broken down 2 amino acids, well then we need to produce and form new amino acids. Either through diet, that we've brought in proteins through diet that we can break down to amino acids, or cells can make. That process is called protein turnover, breaking down old and replacing with new. As a matter of fact, it could also happen that some amino acids are taken out of the blood to go to the muscle. I cannot spell at the moment. It's supposed to say taken. So what if we take these 2 amino acids into the muscle to repair muscle after a workout? Well, then now we're going to have to add in 2 more amino acids. So for whatever amino acids we remove from the amino acid pools, whether they're old amino acids that have to be broken down, or whether they are amino acids that were taken out of the amino acid pool to be used by muscle, we have to replace with new. And that process is called protein turnover. All right, I'm actually going to end there, and we'll pick this up with video number 2.